In October 1215, here at Rochester Castle in Kent, a battle took place between King John and his barons. As the siege raged on, it would become the bloodiest and most infamous in British history. For 7 weeks, 140 knights, barons and men-at-arms were holed up inside these towering stone walls, fighting for their lives. Outside, the king's army battered the castle. Arrows, stones, fire and even human bodies rained down on the barons. It was carnage. But it wasn't just this castle they were fighting for. The very future of the monarchy was on the line as a vicious and ruthless king fought to hang on to his crown. The siege of Rochester Castle was a time of violence and treachery. King John versus the barons. John was greedy, devious and inept. During his 16-year rule, the king had killed his nephew, locked up his brother and extorted and stolen from his subjects. He was the most unpopular king England had ever had. By 1215, the barons had had enough. They tried to control his powers by getting him to sign the Magna Carta. They hoped this would make them more equal, help them retain their powers, and curb the king's incessant taxation. It did no such thing. It incensed the king, who immediately set off for Europe to raise an army. And that's where Rochester Castle comes in. In May 1215, while the king was away, the barons seized control of London in a quick and bloodless coup. By September, John was in Dover, awaiting his 600-strong mercenary army from Europe. The rebels were afraid that John was about to lead these men to London, but between London and Dover lay Rochester. To block his path, the rebels seized Rochester Castle. It was a vast fortress, newly fortified at great expense with state-of-the-art defences. The 113-foot stone keep was ringed by 2 curtain walls, the highest of which was 20 feet, and it was defended on one side by the River Medway. It was from within this fortress that the barons readied their men to fight the king. If they could stop him here, John would be defeated forever. The first clash took place on Wednesday, September the 30th. It was the full force of the nobles, led by 4 of the richest and most powerful at the time, against a small expeditionary force sent by the king. But King John wasn't afraid of these barons. Who were they to challenge the king? He commanded his men to head for Rochester and defeat the rebels, believing the castle would be his in no time. He was in for a surprise. King John's men didn't really stand a chance. From up here, the nobles could see them coming for miles. They would have watched the attacking force come up the road straight to the castle, probably rubbing their hands with glee, knowing that the king's men were about to get a good kicking. As the king's army approached the castle, the knights poured down the hill in a frenzied attack. Skilled longbowmen gave overhead cover to the knights by firing from the castle walls. Volleying 12 arrows a minute, they cut down the advancing troops. The 2 sides crashed together on the hillside. Surprised by this vicious onslaught, the king's men were routed. John's army had failed. Scattering in panic and disarray, they retreated to lick their wounds and come up with another plan. Round 1 to the barons. But the king's men weren't defeated. A few days later, they came back again, this time prepared for battle. They bore down on the castle, brandishing lances and swords. The sky darkened with a hail of arrows. But King John's men this time decided to play it dirty. This time, when the barons charged out of the castle to attack the king's army, they ran straight into a trap. The royal army split up the barons' force and drove half of them onto the bridge over the River Medway. The bridge wasn't anything like the one in Rochester today, obviously. It wasn't much like this one, but basically it was 400 foot long and it spanned the river on big wooden beams which were placed on stone footings, irregularly spaced along the river. Now on these beams they put wooden boards like this, 10 foot wide. Now this bridge was a very treacherous bridge to cross. Very rickety, very precarious, no balustrades, no handrails. You take your life into your hands doing what I'm doing now. When the barons and their men charged onto the rickety old bridge, the king's army made their move. The plan was simple: divide and rule. If they could destroy the bridge, half of the barons' army would be unable to return to the castle, and the castle itself would be isolated, its supply lines severed. But first they had to devise a way to destroy the bridge. Well, it's a wooden bridge, so obviously he could burn it. But how? Well, he could get lots of archers to launch burning arrows at the bridge. But it would have taken hundreds and hundreds of archers to create the sort of inferno that would put Sir Robert Fitzwalter and his men off. He could do what Simon de Montfort did to the same bridge 50 years later. Launch burning boats at it from the shore to set the bridge alight. But you had to get your timing spot on with the tide. Far too fiddly for John. He needed a tactic that left nothing to chance. It's thought he used one of these. John, what is this exactly?
This is a small three-man portable Perrier. These are designed purely and simply as a terror weapon, an anti-personnel weapon, rather than the larger version, which is an anti-castle weapon.
All right, so it's not going to break down any castle walls?
No, no. They shoot small rocks, which when hitting the castle wall explode into shrapnel, and they also fire incendiary devices.
Like what?
Small pots filled with pitch, just exactly the same as Molotov cocktails.
Oh, that's very nasty. And they fire these at people?
They fire them at people. It keeps people's heads down in castles.
I imagine it would. And how fast would this thing operate? I mean, how many rocks a minute could they manage to fire?
The crew can get away 6 rounds a minute if they're under pressure, which means they're being shot at as well. And
6 a minute is very impressive.
6 a minute.
That's one every 10 seconds, isn't
yes,
it? In anyone's book. Then what happened to these people who got hit by burning pitch?
When it exploded, it coated them completely in pitch, and they would catch fire. Ready? Water wouldn't put them out. Hitting wouldn't put it out. We would just set your hand on fire. You would have to have all your friends run up, roll you on the ground, and pee on you.
Right. John's idea was to adapt this weapon. He would no longer use it just to target people, but to destroy something much bigger. And what sort of effect would this have on a wooden bridge?
If you hit it spot on, the pot would explode, pitch would be sprayed all over the bridge, and with any luck, she would go up. Normally, you would have archers backing this up with fire arrows to make sure it goes. All right,
should we go and have a go at burning this bridge then?
Looks a nice bridge.
Right, this is what do you call this? The Greek pot, is it?
This will be full of Greek fire in a second. We'll just light it. If you'd stand back a
I
little.
will, don't you worry.
It is as close to napalm as they could have got.
Okay.
Gentlemen, if you fire.
Ready, train, loose!
Jesus.
Would you like to have a go?
I wouldn't mind. Is this a normal sized crew?
A 3-man crew. This weapon would have been used by the senior ranks, i.e. the armour. When he says tension, you just pull it till it's tension. He will then say 1, 2, 3, and at that point, both of you pull down as hard as you can. I'm going to get out of the way.
Good man.
Ready, tension, loose. Oh, perfect shot.
It was simple but highly effective. The King's men took the barons by surprise and pelted pots at the bridge. Backed by burning arrows to pitch, a runny kind of tar quickly caught fire. The flimsy wooden structure was engulfed in flames. The burning bridge collapsed and sent the rebels scattering. The men stranded on the wrong side of the river had no way of getting back to the castle. Robert Fitzwalter could do nothing to help, so he took his not-so-merry men and returned to London. Round 2 to the King. He still had his army and only half as much enemy to fight. The bridge had been completely destroyed and the rebels were cut off from London and from reinforcements. Talk about burning of bridges. Now the stage was set for a much more equal fight. By the 11th of October, buoyed by their recent success, the King's army broke through the first of the castle walls and forced the nobles to retreat further into the heart of the castle. But they were prepared to fight to the death to retain possession of this keep. 100 men were barricaded inside this keep, which was 5 stories high but only 70 foot square. To make conditions worse, they lived amidst animals, excrement and disease. It was rank and smelly. And outside, the battle was about to step up a gear. On October the 13th, 2 weeks and a day after the siege had begun, King John arrived in Rochester with the rest of the army. Now John was going to drive the nobles mad. The king was being supplied by the good people of the local countryside with food, wine and women. While on the other hand, the nobles had nothing to eat or drink, well, except for water and their own horses. Horse isn't too bad, really. It tastes much like beef. But eating horses was unheard of. They were status symbols, a sign of wealth. Today it would be like eating your car. But the barons butchered and ate theirs, a sure sign they were on their last legs. But this is all part of King John's new plan. If you can't drive them out, starve them out. By now the rebels were tired, demoralised, smelly and hungry. Their supply lines had been cut and they were reaching breaking point. They were not prepared for a siege situation. Although they had a well inside the castle, they'd only stocked up enough food for a few days. But even though they were short on rations and getting desperate, it wasn't all going John's way. King John had a big disadvantage. He just spent a huge amount of money, probably the nobles' money, on having this castle done up. So how is he going to get in? Like medieval ninjas, they could scale the walls with daggers. Which is not something I'm going to do, because this keep is in fact the tallest in England, 113 feet. Or they could fire things at it to see if they can bring the walls down. Well, I'm not going to try that either, because these walls are 12 feet thick. Or they could fire rotting carcasses into the castle with the hope of spreading death and disease. There are stories of defenders coming out of the castle to surrender, only to be killed, mutilated, then fired straight back in the castle as a warning to the others. But the barons wouldn't surrender no matter what John threw at them. The situation reached a stalemate. John could have waited for them to starve to death, but time was a luxury he just didn't have. For a start, he was running out of money. His mercenary army was costing £1,000 a day to maintain, which is more than £750,000 in today's money. With no end to the siege in sight, that kind of expenditure would ruin him. John was also terrified that the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, would come to the Baron's aid and try and steal his crown. He couldn't afford to wait. He had to come up with something pretty evil to get at the Barons. He did. It was to be his blackest trick yet. Soon, all hell would be let loose. Holed up inside the keep, they were slowly starving to death. But John couldn't just wait for them to die. John threw everything he could at the keep. This was the siege to end all sieges. Day and night, 5 massive trebuchets hurled burning pots of oil, rotting carcasses, excrement and rocks. But the walls were 12 feet thick and John couldn't break them down. So his next tactic was more subtle. He brought in a weapon so deadly that the church had tried to ban it 3 times. A weapon that would allow him to pick off the nobles one by one. The crossbow is so lethal that the only safe place for us to fire it is in a wrecker's yard. This is Robin Knight, crossbow maker and expert. Now what's this? This is a typical crossbow, is it?
This is a small, over-the-shoulder English long tiller crossbow. It's a 150-pound draw weight.
What do you exactly mean by draw weight?
The draw weight is the effort required to get the string back to the nut. If you've got a handy 150-pound weight in your pocket, you would need to hang it on there to get the string back to the nut.
And that's the equivalent of the effort you've put in.
That's the effort you put in.
Armed with a crossbow, the poorest peasant could kill a fully armoured noble knight. It was a medieval Uzi. Unlike a traditional longbow, which took at least a decade to master, it took only a few hours to learn how to use a crossbow with deadly accuracy.
With this bow, we need to start with a goat's foot lever.
A goat's foot lever?
A goat's foot lever.
Sounds very technical.
The reason it's called a goat's foot lever is because it looks like a goat's foot.
I'll take your word for that.
The guy that designed this, absolute genius. The bottom legs go over the pin, it hooks onto the string, the nut is already in the receiving position. We palm the lever down, and there it is.
Okie doke.
Do you want to try that? Let's turn it around.
Let's get it the right way around, shall we? John was the first king to see the potential of the crossbow. For the barons, these crossbow snipers were lethal. The bolt of a crossbow could pick off the head of a man at 500 feet.
Put a bolt in there.
All right, now
Remember what I said. This is an over-shoulder bolt.
Right.
So you need to stand up, bring it over onto your shoulder, the top of your shoulder, rest it on the top of your shoulder, 4 fingers on top of the tiller, thumb on the trigger, and shoot the car. Easy.
Hey!
Here you go, Rory. Next target.
Most experienced bowmen drew the string by hand. Oh, I feel the
Got the
force.
shakes.
Yeah. And once drawn, the crossbow was primed and ready to fire instantly. Another advantage over the longbow.
The little boy's coming out.
Less than half a day and I'm a pro. No wonder King John put his faith in men armed with these lethal machines. Good luck, Robin. Oh, nicely. The crossbowmen and siege engines had surrounded the castle for 2 months, battering the nobles day and night. There were less than 100 men left alive in the keep. They were desperate, but holding out for reinforcements from France. Out here, King John was devising his worst trick yet. Fearing the imminent arrival of the French, he'd given up all plans of going over the walls or through them. The trebuchets had made very little progress and the battle was getting desperate. But he had an ingenious plan. The only way in was under, but how? His plan was to dig. John employed a crack team of miners to burrow under the corner of the southeast tower of the keep. To distract the barons and buy the miners time to dig, John ordered his army to keep fighting. Volleys of ammunition from archers and missiles from trebuchets kept on battering the barons. While all this was going on, John started on plan B. B for bacon. Now, he wasn't going to tempt them out with a nice sarnie, he was going to use pigs. Lots of them. This is where John's twisted genius comes in. Pig power. While the miners dug down, he issued one of the strangest royal proclamations ever. King John sent out a decree stating he should be sent with utmost speed 40 of the fattest pigs of the sort least good for eating. That was unlike John, he was normally up for a good banquet, but he was up to something, and it wasn't a party. King John was planning a fire, but not just any old fire. He needed a substance which was highly combustible. And in these days before gunpowder, he decided to use pig fat. Tons of it. His plan was to stuff the mine with pig fat, set fire to it so it'd burn up, crack the foundations, and bring the castle walls tumbling down. But would it work? The man who knows about pigs and fat is slaughterman John Andrews. Now, first of all, these are very much 21st century pigs, aren't they?
Yeah.
How different are these to
It's a
what
different pig altogether. This pig here's got the longer length in the most expensive part,
right.
the loin.
Yeah.
So it'll be a longer pig, a leaner pig. You haven't got the bulkier fat round here or round here.
So basically, John, you're saying is that medieval pig would have been stockier, much bulkier, much fatter.
Yeah.
Now, King John was using this pig fat for burning. Would that make sense to you?
Yeah, once you render the fat, you would make an oil,
Yeah.
and then which would give you something that would combust.
burn at a really high
Which would burn any oil burns at a high temperature.
Once liquefied, pig fat burns at 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, where do you get the fat from on these pigs?
A popular fat is the flead fat. I mean, 100 years ago they made flead cakes, and it's still quite a delicacy now for certain people. That would be a fat that was easily obtainable that you could strip out.
Now, we know that King John used 40 pigs. I mean, 40 big fat pigs, that's going to produce a hell of a lot of fat, isn't it?
I should imagine now you probably want 200 to 300 pigs in this day. and
Really,
age.
for the equivalent
Yeah,
of that?
for the
That's
equivalent.
fascinating, yeah. You can do us a couple of chops while we're here.
Do some sausages.
So John, King John that is, not Butcher John, got 40 fat pigs, stripped down the fat and stuffed it into the mine. Under the rules of medieval warfare, he should have given the barons a final chance to surrender, but he didn't bother with that. Right, here goes. It's November, 12:15. Yeah, this is Rochester Castle. This is a bucket of pig fat. I love it. This is just one bucket. He had 40 pigs worth. Right, let's go and get it lit. The pig fat under the castle swiftly became a roaring inferno. The wooden pit prop supporting the keep collapsed. As the heat intensified to 1,000 degrees, the thick stone foundations blackened and finally began to crack. And what's more, to the starving barons, the smell of bacon must have driven them mad. The entire southeast tower collapsed. A quarter of the keep was destroyed. Pig power rules. The king's men must have thought the battle was finally over, but as one contemporary chronicler recorded, living memory does not recall a siege so fiercely pressed and staunchly resisted. Even now, the barons battled on from the few small parts of the keep that were still standing. They were fighting desperately for their lives. It was a last stand, and they knew it could only end one way. It was just a matter of time. Finally, on November the 30th, 1215, after 7 weeks, the siege came to an end. You might think the bloody battle stopped there, but no. John wanted revenge. It was a matter of pride, but also a matter of the future of the monarchy. A lesson had to be learned, and John was going to make sure it was a tough one. The rules of battle demanded fair treatment for men who gave themselves up, but John wanted to teach people not to mess with a monarchy. He didn't kill the first soldiers to surrender, he did something much worse. He chopped their hands and feet off. The barons he locked up. The rest he'd wanted to hang, but was advised against this mass slaughter by his trusted council, who feared a public outcry. In the end, John only got to hang one person. His victim, a poor young crossbowman who'd grown up in John's court and betrayed him. The battle was over, blood had been spilled, pigs had been fried, and a whole corner of the castle had collapsed to the ground. Few men would put their faith in castles again. King John had won, but little did he know his reign was soon about to end, and it was nothing to do with those dastardly nobles. A year later, he caught dysentery and died. A miserable end to a miserable reign.